Being in the residential school wasn't pretty.
My husband was 11 years in residential school. He never held my girls because he was too scared to break them. That's residential school. That is the impacts of it.
They tried to take our spirits away. They tried to take the Indian out of us.
I was kidnapped in broad daylight, right in front of my parents, when I was being taken away from our outpost camp to go to a residential school.
The children have been taken from us, and we want them back to make the world safe for the children we now have and the ones that are coming.
Le système, il est brisé, il est malhonnête, il n'est pas égal pour tout le monde. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire quand ça arrive des choses-là? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut suggérer au gouvernement de faire, de se corriger de son comportement?
It is so impactful and hurtful to think of children who would be given such disrespect in life and in death.
When you die, you should be buried, you should have a proper burial.
We had a distinct way to honor the people who left us. There were ceremonies, there were songs, and for the children at our schools that are in unmarked burials, they have yet to receive this.
You don't get to the point of religious equality, racial equality, unless you understand foundational inequality in Canada that is steeped in centuries of colonialism and racism by European settlers who imposed their will in a colonial and racist manner.
I'm in a room right now full of survivors who have been through unimaginable abuse and torment only because they were simply born Indigenous.
Like we were not human. The number one law is not to harm a child. And that's exactly what the government did.
Children disappeared at residential schools and other institutions, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten, erased. But they were not forgotten by their families, by their communities, by their people. We can't bring these children back, but we can empower ourselves to ensure that our traditions and communities don't just survive, but thrive.
We couldn't speak our language. We couldn't even use our name. I was given a number. I still remember my number, and that's how they called you. A number.
I was broken spirit since then. I didn't know who I was. I lost my culture, my spirituality, my beliefs, my value.
Some of the young girls, they would go missing for months on end. The priests and the nuns would hide those girls when they got pregnant, and they wouldn't see them for 9 months while they were carrying their babies. And then after that, my mom and two of her cousins were responsible for wrapping those babies and burning them.
As a boy in that residential school, mission school, the burning of little babies being thrown in the furnace by two nuns, and the screaming.
A young woman was disciplined by the nuns and the children, and the man whipped her until she died.
The building was run by the heat from the big stove only in the furnace. There was a lot of babies that was burnt in there.
Some of us didn't know how to deal with our feelings. We didn't know where to go, what to do.
We have boys missing for 50 years now. They were killed. Their lives were taken. They were murdered.
We don't know how many survivors are left. Many of them don't even want to come forward. They chose to forget what has happened to them and not be a part of this. They don't want anything to do with it.
My mom attended residential school in Beauval Mission, La Planche. I'm the youngest of 11 children. The two oldest babies passed away. In her dying bed, my mother said, "Please look for him."
Right now in Italy, we don't have the best cemetery. They didn't listen to our knowledge, and they put the cemetery in a bog. So all of our people right now are being buried in muck and swampy areas. So we're hoping that we can open up a traditional cemetery in Iqaluit so that our people aren't being buried in muck and swamps, and that we can be buried traditionally and with our personal effects.
It's time for Canada as a whole to see this uncomfortable truth for what it is. It's time for them to feel it, see it, sit with those unsettling feelings, and learn from it so it does not happen again. No more denying what our survivors have been saying for years. No more belittling what it was, because it was genocide.
We need to uphold justice for the Indian residential school children who were murdered in these institutions and have those individuals held accountable. These individuals are still alive, and the laws and the policies created by the Canadian government hide their crimes. And in order for us to have justice, these people need to face justice with Canadian laws.
Orange Shirt Day and Every Child Matters was created to honor survivors and their families and to remember those that never made it home.
There's very few people that have that gift and that strength to stand up and speak on behalf of people. And when you have that passion in your heart, that's what drives you to do the good things for your people who need a voice.
It's an honor and a privilege to announce the appointment of Kimberly Murray as Independent Special Interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools.
There are children buried on the grounds of Indian residential school, and we need to find them, and we need to know who they are.
We will survive, and we will strive to see our children grow.
We have to educate our younger generation of the pain, the suffering, the loneliness that we went through.
We are all human beings. That's what we say in our language to everyone, no matter where you come from. We are all people. We are one nation in this land.
Any culture in the world, be proud of your own culture.
We are just starting to heal. We're starting to talk. We're finding our voices. It wasn't easy for any survivor to find our voices.
I can consider every one of the survivors a big miracle. No matter how much tragedy, you're just like a diamond, precious and can't be broken.
What we are carrying through life from the residential schools is a very heavy burden.
When someone is talking to you and sharing with you, they're sharing a part of who they are. Let's put our minds and our hearts together and build a future for our children, a good future.
What we're suggesting is a formation of a team composed of forensic medical examiners, archaeologists, anthropologists, spiritual leaders working in tandem in order to identify the remains of those children who will be found. We have to take an active control over the processes under which those investigations take place.
When I look at this audience, particularly at the young people, I'm reassured that our work of reconciliation will continue into the next generation.
I look forward to working with you for the respect and dignity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in life and in death. And I also look forward to saying the hard truths to this country together.
I want to close with this quote from DeAndre Thomas Hart. They scattered us almost like beads. And now we are picking ourselves up one by one. We are color sorting ourselves. We are restringing them along. We are creating our own design, rebuilding our nations.
There's an awakening happening from nation to nation, and youth, such as yourselves, are the ones that will be leading the way.
Don't let your fires go out. Don't lose your languages. Don't let the ceremonies die.
So in closing, I wanted to say in Creek, Aibumi, which means don't give up.
Be strong as you continue to tell your truth. Be strong as you continue to fight.
I'd like to thank
each and every one of you for all of the wonderful work that you do for all of the survivors, for our communities, for our families.
I wrote in my final report that the greatest and most important obligation that we all have is to survivors. They must be honored and acknowledged for their courage, determination, and advocacy to raise public awareness about the truths of unmarked burials of children. Survivors have shared these truths for decades, but their testimonies have been dismissed or ignored. They are our living witnesses to what happened in Indian residential schools and other institutions, and we must listen to their truths. When I commenced my work as the special interlocutor, I met with survivors and elders to create some principles to guide the work that I would be doing. And the first principle that we created together was that the bodies and spirits of missing and disappeared children must be treated with honor, respect, and dignity. And that's so very important because we know that the children were not treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they were taken from their families and their communities and placed in Indian residential schools and other institutions. The second guiding principle was that survivors must be honored and acknowledged for raising public awareness about the truths of unmarked burials of children who died at these institutions. As I said, survivors have been speaking these truths for decades, long before Tk'emlúps announced the 215 a number of years ago. The third guiding principle that the elders and survivors created with me was that Indigenous families and communities have the right to know what happened. They have a right to know what happened to their children who died while in the care of the state and churches. And this is an internationally recognized right, the right to know the truth. The next guiding principle, the fourth guiding principle, is that the search for unmarked burials and the recovery of missing and disappeared children must be governed by Indigenous laws and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We know there are many, many provisions, articles in the UN Declaration that speak to the importance of ensuring the protection of our ancestors, that speak to the importance of not separating children from their families, and speak to the importance of returning the ancestors to their communities and their families. The final guiding principle was that the searches and investigations must follow the truth. This requires tracing the movement of each child using records and survivor testimonies from when a child was first taken to an Indian residential school through to any other institution that they were taken to. The crimes that occurred in these institutions are, in my view, and in others' views and survivors' views, crimes against humanity. Survivors, Indigenous families, and communities are calling for accountability and justice against individual perpetrators and against the government and churches that operated the institutions. Many questions arise about what mechanisms, if any, exist to hold people to account. Crimes are crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute when they are widespread and systematic. They include murder, the forceful transfer of people, imprisonment, the deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, slavery, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, enforced disappearance of persons, and medical experimentation. All of these crimes and others were committed in Indian residential schools and other colonial institutions on a widespread and systematic basis against Indigenous children. In forced disappearances, in my final report, I specifically focus on that crime. I argue that many of the missing children taken to Indian residential schools and to some of the other institutions by the state are in fact disappeared. There is an important distinction between the terms missing and disappeared. While both may refer to the absence of a person, being disappeared specifically requires the absence to be as a result of force against the will of the person. The term missing may be accurate in the literal sense and properly describe the longing of families for their loved ones. But it fails, however, to reflect the government's culpability and responsibility for the fact that the children died and went missing, not because of the children's choices or actions, but because of purposeful state violence, action, and force. The children did not simply vanish. They were not disappeared by accident. The forced removal and transfer of Indigenous children was Canadian law and policy. The state actively sought to break the children's sense of identity and belonging and to sever their bonds to their families and their communities. Those in charge of the institutions knew that the children's chances of surviving were low. They exposed the children to diseases that killed them, refused to provide them with adequate food and medical care, and they permitted non-consensual human experiments to be conducted on them. The conditions were so deadly that cemeteries were a regular part of the design of the institutions. Evidence of these cemeteries is included in my Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience volume of the final report. This report shows that cemeteries were part of the Indian residential schools from the outset, and that the government planned for the deaths of the children. The evidence shows how the federal government and the churches dehumanized the children in life and after death. When the children died, government and church officials often did not return the children to their families and communities for burial. They were buried instead in cemeteries at the institutions, often in unmarked and mass graves that were sometimes dug by other children. Many of these cemeteries and burial sites were neglected, abandoned, and left unprotected, and became vulnerable to disturbance and desecration. Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience focuses on the documented Indian residential school cemeteries where children are known to be buried. 20 representative examples of these burial locations with the images of historical records that support the testimonies of survivors are included in this volume. And here's some of the evidence in the report. This is in Lejac, British Columbia. Lejac Indian Residential School was in operation between 1922 to 1976. At least 2 cemeteries are known to exist at this institution. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified the deaths of 39 children that were taken here. It is likely that more deaths will be identified as further investigations continue. The top of this document on the screen is an excerpt from the death registration that was filed with the federal government and with the provincial government of British Columbia. It clearly states that this child was buried at the Lejac Res School Cemetery. The bottom part of the slide is a photo of the wooden crosses that marked some of the graves at Lejac. These types of markers that were at many institutional cemeteries are now gone, along with the wooden fences that surrounded them. Finding the exact location of the cemeteries and their boundaries is being done with survivor testimony, historical records, and ground truthing technologies. Several survivors of Lejac have recounted how they witnessed burials being moved from the first cemetery to a second burial ground in 1951. This is Dunbow. The deaths of at least 73 children are associated with this institution in Alberta. Many children were buried in the institution's graveyard. In some cases, children were buried 2 to 3 in one coffin. Children were forced to work in the Dunbow Cemetery as seen in this photograph. This was the case at many, if not most, Indian residential schools and other institutions, including the Indian hospitals. After the Dunbow Industrial School was shut down in 1922, the federal government failed to maintain the cemetery. In July of 1936, a Department of Indian Affairs inspector wrote that, and this is a quote, "The graveyard there was being trampled over by cattle, and that the cattle had knocked all the crosses down, and that the cemetery was in terrible shape." This cemetery was located on the banks of the Highwood River. In 1996, the burials of the children were exposed when the river overflowed. In some instances, the children's remains were washed away by the floodwaters, and they are still in the river to this day. In 2001, the Tsuut'ina Nation Cultural Museum, with the guidance of the elders, relocated the burials of 34 children at a nearby site away from the river. The new burial site is now marked with a monument and is protected by a proper fence, with a proper fence. This is Maryvale, where 751 identified targets were announced shortly after the announcement from Kamloops. This is a photo of the Maryvale Cemetery in Saskatchewan. Oral history from community members indicates that the grave markers were removed at the instigation of a local priest. The act erased important information about where the children are buried. A survivor, a living witness, remembers that he and other children saw workers arriving in a truck to remove the headstones and wooden crosses from the cemetery in the early 1960s. This is Shingwalk in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. A cemetery on the grounds of the Shingwalk Institution was part of Principal Wilson's plans even before the first child died there. In 1876, Wilson wrote in the Algoma Missionary News that he had, quote, "set apart God's acre, a little spot, retired, peaceful, on a gentle slope near to a little lake, surrounded by a thick growth of young fir, trees, and birch. It is only a chain square, and our boys have built a stone wall around it." This is the Department of Indian Affairs hand-drawn diagram showing the institution grounds and the location of the graveyard at the Edmonton Residential School. An appraisal document dated 1970 noted that there is, and this is a quote, "there is a small graveyard just west of the building and garden site and along the south boundary of this property. It covers an area of approximately 100 by 12 feet. In 1971, Canada transferred the land where the cemetery is located to the province of Alberta. In 1979, the land was then transferred to the city of St. Albert, which annexed the cemetery to some adjacent land to create a municipal cemetery. Multiple transfers of lands between governments and in some cases, private landowners is impeding the ability for families and communities to find where the children are buried. I wrote of one example in my report at the Brandon Indian Residential School. The land where one of the cemeteries related to this institution is now privately owned by a campground where people have their campers on top of the burials. My Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience report also highlights how the Indian residential school system intersected with many other institutions and systems. Parents and communities were often not informed when their children were transferred from one Indian residential school to another, or from an Indian residential school to a hospital, a TB sanatorium, or a reformatory. One system that intersected with the Indian residential schools was the working out system. Beginning in the late 19th century, Canada adopted the working out system, which was originally developed in the Indian boarding schools in the United States. In this system, children and youth of all ages were trafficked from Indian residential schools to perform manual labor. They were forced to live and work in homes, on farms, and in businesses. Their work placements were always brokered by the Indian agents and the principals. Under the working out system, children were provided with room and board and sometimes a very small wage for their labor. Although the children may have received a small wage, the use of their money was scrutinized and controlled by the Department of Indian Affairs. The children were expected to use their earnings to cover their own clothing costs and other expenses that would normally be covered by the Indian residential school. The federal government held the children's earnings in a savings account and used its control over the accounts as leverage to ensure that the children would remain in the residential school system until the government decided that they could be discharged. Many children were injured and died while being trafficked in this way. This is the Coqualitza Indian Hospital. Just as in the Indian residential school system, government officials sought out the least expensive burial options for the bodies of Indigenous people that died in the hospitals. At the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital in Edmonton, deceased patients were buried on the grounds of the Edmonton Indian Residential School, using the forced labor of the children to dig the graves. This is the Cecil Butters Memorial Hospital. It was a private institution that originally opened in 1947. Several Indigenous children were known to have been placed at the Cecil Butters Memorial Hospital by the Department of Indian Affairs. A 1962 report on this institution found that the institution had a high death rate and that the hospital was, I quote, cooperating with a Boston doctor who was conducting experiments on the Mongoloid children. The children that died here are buried in unmarked and mass graves in and around the former site of the hospital. In my interim report that I released in this June of 2023, July, forget the date, I wrote about Marie Yvonne Alaka. In the early 1960s, Marie Yvonne was only 4 years old when she was taken from her home and sent on a float plane to the Sir Joseph Bernier Federal School in Chesterfield Inlet, Nunavut. When Marie Yvonne was not returned home in the summertime, her parents immediately went to see the Catholic priest to find out where she was. From that moment on and until his passing in 2007, Marie Yvonne's father searched for her. He spent over 53 years trying to find out what happened to his daughter. Marie Yvonne's mother thought that the search for Marie Yvonne had ended when her husband died. She thought that she would never know what happened to her daughter. Then a family friend with some research experience stepped in to help. The search for Marie Yvonne was very difficult because the church had changed her name. Eventually, Marie Yvonne was traced through the Eskimo identification number that had been assigned to her by Canada. This is what the family learned after 50 years of searching for the truth. While at the Sir Joseph Bernier Residential School, Marie Yvonne was apparently injured when she hit her head playing outside the institution. She was sent to a hospital in Churchill, Manitoba. While in the hospital in Churchill, she contracted TB. She was then transferred to a hospital in Winnipeg, then to a TB sanatorium in Toronto, and then to another hospital in Montreal. At the hospital in Montreal, she contracted meningitis and became paralyzed in all 4 of her limbs. Her final transfer was to the Cecil Butters Memorial Hospital, where she passed away at the age of 8. Marie Yvonne did not speak English, only Inuktitut. As she was transferred from one institution to another, she was sent on her own without any family to hold her hand, comfort her, or make medical decisions on her behalf. Marie Yvonne's parents were never notified of her injury or of these 5 institutional transfers. Marie Yvonne is buried over 2,000 kilometers away from her home. She is buried in an unmarked mass grave with as many as 60 other children in the same grave. I personally attended 3 of the cemeteries associated with this institution and spoke to local residents. I was told that in addition to the cemeteries I visited, there are 2 other areas where children may be buried. Neither area is formally recognized or protected as a cemetery. This is George Painter. He is one of the boys that was accused and eventually convicted of setting a fatal fire at the Cross Lake Indian Residential School. George was 7 years old when he was sent to the Cross Lake Indian Residential School and remained there until the time of the fire, about 9 or 10 years later. Before the fire, George had tried to escape the Indian Residential School, but was caught, brought back, and punished. George was charged with setting the fire, and his case was heard in adult court. Canada did not provide him with a lawyer. He pled guilty and was given the maximum sentence, life imprisonment. On October 27th, 1931, George was admitted to the Stony Mountain Penitentiary to serve his life sentence. In 1939, George's father attempted to have the case reviewed, but the Department of Indian Affairs would not support his parole application, and efforts to have George released failed. George died in the Winnipeg General Hospital on February 20th, 1947, at the age of 32, having spent half of his life in prison and most of the first part of his life at an Indian residential school. Following his death, he was buried in the prison cemetery, where many other Indigenous people are buried. Their burials are marked only with numbers. In my final report, I note that enforced disappearance of persons is not only a crime against humanity, but it is also a violation of international human rights law. In 1992, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which led to the 2006 Convention on Enforced Disappearance. Enforced disappearances strike at the very core of human rights. They are an offense to human dignity and a violation of a person's right not to be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. They are also a violation of the right to liberty and security of the person. The international human rights violation of enforced disappearance consists of 3 elements. There must be a deprivation of liberty that the state authorized or supported, and there exists a refusal to acknowledge the disappearances, or there is a concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. This, in my view, is exactly what happened to these children. Children were detained in Indian residential schools and other associated institutions, often without the consent of a parent or only with coerced consent. The federal government authorized the detention of the children and then disappeared them by failing to investigate their deaths and by failing to notify the families of their fate. Under international law, enforced disappearances are continuing offenses. They continue if the perpetrators conceal the fate and whereabouts of the person who has been disappeared. This means that as long as the fate of these children is unknown, Canada and the churches are still committing the offense. I encourage everyone to consider shifting their language from identifying the children as missing and to start recognizing that there are both missing and disappeared children. This shift in language has significant impacts. First, it highlights the gravity of the human rights violations committed against the disappeared children. And it also demands that Canada uphold its international legal obligations to the children, their families, and their communities. One obligation that Canada has under international law is to take appropriate measures to investigate and hold perpetrators criminally responsible. Canada is also obligated to provide effective remedies and reparations, including providing information that can help determine the identities of the disappeared children, the date when the children were taken, the places where they were originally taken to and then transferred to, the circumstances of their deaths, and where they are now buried. I want to go back to the guiding principle of the right to know the truth. The right to know the truth about mass human rights violations is an internationally recognized right of victims, their families, and I argue communities. The state has a corresponding duty to remember the history of atrocities committed in order to combat impunity and prevent reoccurrence. In settler colonial countries like Canada, state archives can either serve to perpetuate settler amnesty and cultivate a culture of impunity, or to strengthen truth, accountability, justice, and non-reoccurrence of mass human rights violations. Several reports of UN Special Rapporteurs speak to the important role that archives and archivists have in preserving historical records. Many reports call for greater transparency and accessibility to archives. In my final report, I write that Canada, provinces, and other institutions like universities must protect and preserve records relating to the disappeared children. As institutions of collective memory, access to archives enables Indigenous families and communities and all citizens to determine the truth about what happened. I want to now speak about the obligations I identified in upholding sacred obligations. In relation to enforced disappearances and in accordance with UN standards, Canadian authorities have an obligation to ensure prompt, thorough, and impartial investigations into all potentially unlawful deaths and disappearances. Investigations must respect the children's families and communities who have the right to know the truth about what happened to their disappeared loved ones. I argue that the Canadian state cannot investigate its own wrongdoing, and that Indigenous nations exercising their sovereignty are best placed to lead these investigations with the support of an Indigenous-led and governed Commission of Investigations. Several countries around the world have established search and truth recovery mechanisms to investigate enforced disappearances. These offices or commissions of investigation can be created through legislation. They are mandated to investigate missing persons and enforced disappearances where the state or its agents are responsible for the disappearances. They're established to reveal the truth of what happened to the missing and disappeared as part of a larger reparations process. As I have noted, the right to truth is owed to Indigenous peoples. Canada has legal and moral obligations to ensure that a full investigation is conducted into disappearances and deaths of these children. I believe that Canada has an international obligation to establish a commission of investigations into missing and disappeared Indigenous children and unmarked burials. This commission of investigation should be created by legislation that upholds Indigenous sovereignty and laws and explicitly recognizes that survivors, Indigenous families, and communities can freely choose whether to work with the commission of investigation or to conduct their own independent investigations. During my mandate as a special interlocutor, several concerns were raised that require investigation. They include investigations into the deaths and disappearances of Indigenous children who were taken to the Indian hospitals, TB sanatoriums, and psychiatric institutions. Investigations into the deaths and disappearance of Indigenous children at other institutions, including orphanages, institutions for children with disabilities, homes for unwed mothers, reformatories, and former juvenile detention centers. This document on the screen is evidence of the state sending a child from the Mount Elgin Institute to the Mimico Reformatory in Ontario. Investigations into the human experimentation that occurred on Indigenous people, including children. This slide shows some of the experiments and research that was done on children. A study of the mental ability of the Indian children at the Mohawk Institute, a look at the children of Kagnawagna, and a pilot study on Eskimo school children. And finally, the Commission of Investigation could also investigate the deaths and disappearances of babies born, stolen, and killed at Indian residential schools and other associated institutions, as you all heard from the testimony in the video that I showed at the beginning of this talk. In my final report, I wrote that it's time for Canada to shift from a culture of amnesty and impunity to a culture of accountability and justice. And this starts with a proper Indigenous-led reparations framework. Of the many human rights violations inflicted on Indigenous children and their families, the disappearances and deaths of thousands of Indigenous children is the ultimate act of injustice that requires reparations. I argue that a reparations framework in Canada must be developed through an anti-colonial lens that highlights the importance of Indigenous laws, international human rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I don't have time today to speak about all the elements of the reparations framework that I propose, but I encourage everyone to read, at minimum, the executive summary of my final report and the 42 obligations I have identified. Survivors, Indigenous families, and communities, and those children that did not survive the institutions, those children buried in unmarked and mass graves, deserve no less. In the final chapter of my report, I call on Canadians to become upstanders to reconciliation, to be receptive to learning about and fully acknowledging that atrocities, genocide, and crimes against humanity have been committed against Indigenous people in this country, and to proactively foster reconciliation based on truth, accountability, and justice. I want to end this lecture with this quote from President Nathan Obed of the Inuit Tepirit Kanatami. At the national event in Iqaluit, he said the following: "There is a point where we have to look people in the eye and tell them that their conduct is unacceptable, and that some things are non-negotiable. I say that this point in time is now. We must all tell the Canadian state that its conduct has been and continues to be unacceptable, and that it must now provide full reparations for the crimes against humanity it has perpetrated on Indigenous children, families, and communities." And with that, I say thank you, Nawagoa, again to the David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights for inviting me to deliver the Morris A. Gross Memorial Lecture. It's been my honor. Thank you.
So Kimberly said that she would be happy to take some questions. So we have a mic there if there's anybody who has any questions. Or comments, yes.
Hi, my name is Darlene Berlow. I'm an alumni. It's here a very long time ago. Since then, I've done some work just as a supporter with the Anishinaabe Health Center. You know what came to my, and I've just read Murray Sinclair's book, and I was sort of wondering, like, what's next? And what I was thinking is that maybe what's next is right in front of me. I'm very active in my community, and there's a giant building in front of me that I'm working with Diane Sachs in changing. It's filled with Indigenous murals. And there is a desire amongst some to have it as an Indigenous language center. And that might be what's next. I don't know how a person goes about that, but there's a possibility.
Thank you for your question and your comment. And I just want to acknowledge the good work that Anishinaabe Health does in the city of Toronto, a longstanding organization that's really very important that we continue to.
You know, the building.
Yes. Yes, and congratulations. You know, I do write, and I have a chapter on well-being in my final report, and I talk about the importance of culture and language for the wellness of community members that have gone through this trauma. And the TRC, as you know, had a full chapter on this as well in their legacy volume, and also there was some discussion in the reconciliation volume. And so I do think it's really important. You know, one of the things I always pointed out during my mandate was Canada always found the money to rebuild these institutions, right? We had 2 chapters on fires in the Truth and Reconciliation final report. That's how many fires there were. And Canada always found the money to rebuild them. But they can't find the money to build health centers and provide healing supports in communities. We found the money during the Depression to rebuild these institutions. I mean, let's just speak that truth. We need to have supports in communities to heal from this trauma. And I argue, and it's part of my reparation framework, that that's part of the bigger reparation that we need to have in this country.
Questions? So I first met him when I was a child rights lawyer at Justice for Children and Youth, and she was the director of Aboriginal Legal Services. And even, you know, with my sort of orientation toward children's rights, this was sort of a lack of knowledge that I had, just how the depth of the despair and trauma that had been perpetrated against children. I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, home of the Mohawk Institute. And my grandmother used to say, as she walked like past that place, that's a place with a lot of sadness. But she never said why. It took, you know, I was an adult before I understood what the Unmarked Institute was about. And actually, during the time I was a lawyer at Justice for Children, it came much later. And I just really want to thank him for your hard work. And I know that that was not an easy job to do. And I thank you for coming here and sharing this with us, and for helping us to frame this not as a tragedy, but as actually a crime. And for us to think about how we need to move forward and advocating for a framework that really does ask for accountability as one would for a crime. Thank you so much.